Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and you can listen to all our past episodes and also find out how you can support this podcast by going to our websites. The links are in the show notes. Happy Earth Day, everyone. This is an Earth Day focused episode with author and academic Richard Twine. We will be discussing his latest book called The Climate Crisis and Other Animals. And in his book, I'm going to read a quote from his book right here that kind of sums up what we will be talking about. And he says, quote, "The climate crisis is inextricably a question of animal ethics and the politics of human-animal relations." This is an important book. It's definitely an academic read. It's pretty dense, kind of a thick book, but we're going to break it down for you. So often on Earth Day, I think about how my activist career was started in environmental activism. One of my very first jobs was with Greenpeace. And then what brought me west to the Western United States was the plight of the redwood forests in the Pacific Northwest. And I joined with Earth First doing tree sits and logging road lockdowns in the 90s. So the environmental movement is very dear to my heart, and I often wonder what my life would be like had I continued down the road of eco activism. But the farmed animals, they called to me. They called me to their side, so I diverted to vegan activism early on. But the environmental impacts of animal agriculture, they've always been a strong connection for me, a strong motivator for me. It's it's strange to think about how we are devastating this planet and her animals, and it's happening so fast. We saw a sudden spike in global temperatures just last year that kind of blew far beyond what statistical climate models had predicted. And of course, the frequency of, and intensity of the heat waves and wildfires and storms and floods all over the planet are just getting worse. One of the reasons that we left Sonoma County, my husband and I left Sonoma County, California, was because of the constant threat of wildfires. And it seemed that in the last 15 years, like every wildfire season, which was like 10 months out of the year, we would be just inundated with smoke from some fire somewhere close for weeks. And we were under the threat of evacuation orders a few times. We felt like it was kind of playing with fire to stay there. But we're not out of the woods entirely in Eugene, Oregon, where we are now. We're still surrounded by gorgeous forest here, but at least it rains here. We know the rain is coming. Not the case in California. So in a way, we're kind of like climate refugees, though there are much more dire circumstances for others in the world, like, the islands in the Maldives and the Marshall Islands that are going to be underwater soon due to sea level rise. We're able to just move to another state. I mean, their whole world is going to be underwater. But what about the animals? We don't often think about the animals and how they're going to be affected by climate disruption. And that is what we want to talk about today. So let's now turn our focus and attention to the animals of planet Earth for Earth Day. Okay, today on the podcast, we have Dr. Richard Twine. He is a professor in sociology and co-director of the Center for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill University in the UK. His latest book is The Climate Crisis and Other Animals, out of Sydney University Press. And he is the co-editor with another author, Nick Taylor, of The Rise of Critical Animal Studies from Margins to the Center, and author of Animals as Biotechnology, Ethics, Sustainability, and Critical Animal Studies. And both of those are published by Routledge. Since 2001, he has published articles on ecofeminism, vegan transition, the food system, and the animal industrial complex. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Thank you very much.
So, Richard, we like to start the podcast by getting to know you. And our first question is why you went vegan, why and when you went vegan.
Sure. So when I was 18 at university in my first year, that was my first step, and I went vegetarian. And so that was 1992. And it took me a while to get fully vegan. 2005, I was fully vegan, so age 31. I've
Mm,
just turned 50, so I've now
okay.
been vegan for 19 years. And yeah, it was initially those reasons were environmental and animal ethics, and I guess like health is kind of reinforced maybe in the last 10, 15 years more. And also because I was an early reader of books like The Sexual Politics of Meat. I read that when I was 19 or 20, and
Yes,
there's
by
always like
Carol Adams.
there was always a gender dimension to that. So I think like contesting masculinity was also like bound up in that. And yeah, I think in the 1990s, sort of vegetarianism was the kind of normalized practice, and veganism became a lot more intelligible and understandable and achievable in the first decade of the century. So yeah, like many people, it's like, oh, I wish I'd gone vegan sooner, but at least I got there in the end.
Yeah, and wow, in 2005, and you said that one of your main reasons was environmental. And I can really resonate with that because back then that wasn't really one of the messages that you heard very much. But I also was in kind of environmental circles and in the environmental community, and I learned that, I learned about the impact of animal agriculture on the environment, and that was one of my main reasons for going vegan as well. So I love that you had that kind of insight early.
Yeah, I think back in the 90s, it was probably more in terms of resource use and land use, and then the climate reasons came in a little bit later. There was more awareness around those. But I actually, as an 18-year-old, I was going to be doing an environmental science degree. Ended up dropping that and doing more like environmental sociology and environmental philosophy. That was like a better place for me. So I always sort of had that environmental context to my thinking probably from my age 15, 16 probably.
Well, before we get into your latest book, I'm curious to start kind of broadly with critical animal studies because you co-authored a book on critical animal studies. And, I think a lot of people don't realize that there is a whole category of animal studies at the graduate level. Can you give us kind of a brief overview of what critical animal studies is?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a vibrant field, and it's also quite a slightly tense field as well, because critical animal studies emerged around about 2005 out of a sort of feeling of discomfort with what the animal turn, as it's called, had done so far at that time. So the animal turn was basically the phrase used to describe how different academic disciplines were gradually and slowly coming to realize that human animal relations should be within their discipline, whatever that discipline might be, whether it's history or sociology or philosophy. But then many of us felt at that time that some of the scholars involved in that work were not being critical enough, and were not necessarily embracing their own personal political commitments to that field. And so critical animal studies arose as a more strident version, really, of animal studies, which really wanted to situate what was happening to human animal relations within that broader context of capitalism and gender and colonialism and so on. So it is the critical animal studies is the study of human animal relations, but with a critical and pro-animal focus on the circumstances and the treatment of non-human animals. And I guess it's been a struggle to get that established in the academy, and it's an ongoing process. But it's the first sort of community of scholars, and we define ourselves as scholars slash activists, the first community of scholars that are actually identify as vegan. So I think it's quite a significant moment in time that there is this international community of scholars that identify with a pro-animal politics and identify with vegan practice as well.
Yeah, wonderful. It's really exciting to see. And we've had a few guests on that have been very involved with critical animal studies, like Vasile Stanescu, that was on recently. So let's talk about your latest book. That's why I invited you on today. It's called The Climate Crisis and Other Animals. Congratulations, by the way. I know how much work a book is. It's really wonderful that you were able to get it out. I want to start broadly. And you say in the book that climate change is not really about emissions, but about power. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, I don't want to say that it's not about emissions because clearly it is about emissions. But
Right.
really, what we need to focus on is what are the the practices behind those emissions? What are the systems? What are the societal infrastructures that are causing those emissions? The social
Yeah.
norms,
Yeah.
the histories of the energy system, the histories of the food system, and so on. And so the overfocus on emissions tends to depoliticize the climate crisis. And
Mm.
so this is why I spend so much time in chapter one, which I guess I should warn listeners that chapter one is probably the most theoretical chapter of the book, and that I kind of I join in that chapter. I join in with the sociological critique of the idea of the Anthropocene, and broadly I support the alternative idea of the Capitalocene as a designator for the era that we're living in, because the Anthropocene tends to fall into this trap of depoliticizing the climate crisis and not really offering a history of how the climate crisis came into being, which is
Okay, so you're
exactly,
gonna
yeah.
have to define those terms for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's fine. Yeah. So the Anthropocene idea has been put forward by scientists who want to sort of say that this is the first human created epoch that we're living in. One of the main ways in which social scientists have found that concept unsatisfactory is that it tends to suggest that that all of humanity, all of the anthropos are responsible for climate change and the climate crisis. And so it doesn't deconstruct the climate crisis according to the different relations of power that have actually produced climate change. So what the capitalist scene wants to do is, as the name suggests, situate the climate crisis within the history of the development of capitalism, and specifically a history of capitalism, which includes patriarchal gender relations. It very much includes the history of colonialism, and it also includes the history of human-animal relations and how we've treated the more than human, the other animal species and ecologies generally. So I join in with that critique and very much support the concept of the capitalist scene, and I try to actually make it even better by giving it a much more comprehensive understanding of human-animal relations in it as well. So
Okay.
I say that the relations of power, capitalist, gendered, colonialist, and human-centered human-animal relations, we can't understand the emergences of the climate crisis, the effects of the climate crisis, and the unwillingness of institutions to change without also paying attention to those relationships of power. And that's another way of saying, and me arguing as a sociologist, that we need to appreciate the role of the social sciences, and then perhaps also other disciplines as well, and the arts and humanities. We need to say, yeah, the climate science is obviously very, very important for understanding emissions data and all the other things that climate scientists do. But we need the social scientists as well, and we need the philosophers and the geographers and the historians to give us that comprehensive understanding of what the climate crisis is, what it's a crisis of, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of expanding on that, you also talk about climate justice, and this is very much part of what you're talking about. You talk about like classed and racialized and gendered dimensions of the climate crisis. Can you talk just a little bit about what climate justice is?
Sure. So climate justice is an attempt to have that linkaging of social justice issues and how they intersect with the climate issue. So it's
Yeah.
getting quite close to what we might call an intersectional understanding of the climate crisis, trying to understand how the climate crisis is affecting poorer people differently, trying to understand why men are more likely to engage in high emitting practices,
Hmm.
and also thinking about the geopolitical and neo-colonial relationships still at play in the climate crisis as well. But however, it's still caught within its own human-centeredness, its own anthropocentrism. So it remains as an idea, climate justice is still silent on issues of care and justice towards non-human animals. And it really sort of constitutes part of the theme of the book that we meaning humanity, keep trying to address the environmental crisis, which is partly shaped by an ideology of human-centeredness, of anthropocentrism, with yet more anthropocentrism. So we fail to entertain a more transformative shift in our relations and values towards non-human animals
Yeah.
and ecologies.
Yeah.
So I'm aware that I've also introduced another concept there. So I'll say a little bit more about that. So I've said anthropocentrism there a couple of times, and
Yeah.
and clearly like a sort of easy definition of that is just that it means human-centeredness. But
Right.
in the book, I'm employing a slightly more sophisticated definition of it, and I'm using a definition by an American philosopher called Matthew Calarco. I'm a big admirer of his work. And he defines anthropocentrism as having various characteristics. So he talks about a narcissistic focus on the idea that only humans count ethically, legally, and politically. And he also talks about anthropocentrism as consisting of a binary account of human animal differences. This is the idea that there's a very sharp dividing line between the human and other animals, which in critical animal studies, we definitely don't agree with that. He also talks about anthropocentrism as including a tendency to dehumanize and subhumanize certain populations. So it's also about the animalization of humans as well, usually along lines of class, race, and gender. And finally, the final characteristic of anthropocentrism that Matthew Calarco talks about is that it's the institutions within society aim to protect and give privilege to beings that are deemed fully human. So it's talking about that institutional level as well. And it's this very ideology of anthropocentrism which we can see, which I argue is in crisis. And that's what we need to address if we want to meaningfully contest climate and biodiversity breakdown. And
Mm.
there's not been enough emphasis on that. In fact, it's often excluded, and it's certainly excluded from the idea of climate justice.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So building on that, you really start getting into this issue in chapter 3 of the book. You start discussing how climate change affects other animals, wild animals, and and like you were saying, when we hear about the detrimental effects of climate disruption, it's almost always in the context of how it affects humans and our human world and our human lives, like infrastructure or our health or our economy. And then secondarily, you hear about the impacts on the environment, but those are more broad, and rarely ever do you hear about the impacts on wild populations of animals, individual animals. What did you want to say about this? Why did you focus your book on this?
Sure, there's definitely an exclusion going on there. I mean, some media and some documentaries do a better job and try to remind us of the effects on species and even
Yeah.
individual animals sometimes. But yeah, I call that chapter 3 How Climate Breakdown is Undermining Animal Life. And I discuss, like, first of all, I discuss, well, how should I frame this chapter? Because yes, certainly there needs to be a focus on wild animals, but the framing isn't just on wild animals. So I don't want to just focus on the kind of charismatic megafauna. I focus on insects as well, and I even focus on microorganisms.
Yeah.
And more fundamentally, I wanted to give some sense of voice to the species already harmed by the climate crisis as well. So I
Mm.
wanted to make sure that a broad range of species are represented. And in doing so, it rectifies this human-centered, this anthropocentric framing of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And so I focus on population loss. The conservation biologists use the term defaunation to refer to the loss of numbers of specific species, the destruction of what ecologists call ecological assemblages, these relationships that many species have with each other and with other plant species as well. So all these sort of species interdependencies that I wanted to bring to light.
Yeah, you really get into some individual species that have been affected, and I was really surprised actually to see that you cited several species that have been affected by or have gone extinct actually due to climate change. The bramble K melones, is that how you say it?
I think it's the Bramble K melames, but I'm not.
Malamise. Okay. Okay. So a little rodent that lives in a small island on the Great Barrier Reef. This was the first mammal to be reported extinct due to sea level rise. And I guess I was surprised because you always hear meteorologists and scientists, and they say that they can't pinpoint one event or, this one hurricane or this one wildfire and link it to climate change. That oh yes, climate change may have contributed, but we can't actually link it exactly to. But you show in chapter 3, there's a lot of science that shows that melting ice, rising temperatures are affecting animals all over the world. You mentioned narwhals and walruses, like the megafauna you were talking about, but also so many birds and insects and all kinds of animals. I was so struck by the numerous accounts of like mass die-offs and starvations of marine life and mammals and birds, and that there has been science that is directly linking these events to climate disruption. 1 million seabirds in the Pacific, 100,000 fruit bats in Australia. I mean, it just goes on and on. It was like shocking and amazing in a horrible way that there was so much science around this, and you just don't hear about it. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, I think you only hear about it if you go looking for it and if you're
Right.
sort of monitoring the sort of media outlets which do cover it, I suppose. We are talking about a great unraveling of the conditions for earthly survival of many species.
Mm,
And we see the combination of extreme weather events and also a slower gradual impact in terms of the background of rising sea levels and temperatures. And yeah, I think it's definitely that the case that rising temperatures and other climate changes are contributing to extreme weather events and all the different records that are broken on an annual basis.
yeah.
And so I think there's not really a problem there in terms of making the scientific link. It's just a case of whether we can get those events to actually engender change, because I guess at the moment they're not really engendering change. We can see that some of the stats that come out from some of the studies are quite revealing. So Sabalos, who's been an important figure in this research, talks about biological annihilation. That's a phrase from their 2020 paper, and they examined thousands of species of terrestrial vertebrates and found 515 of those to be on the brink of extinction, which they defined as having less than 1,000 individuals.
Mm,
And then the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List, it's quite well known. It keeps track of endangered species. As of the end of 2022, they found that over 41,000 species were threatened with extinction. I think using a slightly higher bar than having more than 1,000 individuals. But this included 41% of amphibians and 27% of mammals threatened with extinction.
well,
And when we recall that, of the entire mammalian biomass on the planet, 60% of that is farmed animals, 36% is humans, and only 4% is wild animals. That
mm,
puts everything into perspective. So, yeah, there are certainly events and changes that can be directly linked to climate change. And Yeah, these examples show the decimation of species habitats. Their homes are either melting under their feet, or heat waves and wildfires and droughts are making life unlivable for them. And another example is aquatic life as well, which I don't neglect in the chapter. I think it's important to include aquatic life.
Yeah.
And what are aquatic species supposed to do when faced with the triple threat of temperature change, acidification, and deoxygenation? Well, there's nowhere else they can go. It would be the equivalent of terrestrial species like ourselves having our air poisoned. It's just something that we wouldn't be able to escape.
Yeah, that term biological annihilation from that study that you cited, wow, it's really intense. And I thought that was very interesting that you added in sea life, and you kind of talk about how cold-blooded animals are a kind of an indicator or an early warning system in a way, and they can be affected early on with just small changes.
Absolutely, and yeah, it's a very sobering area. So yeah, chapter 3 was definitely filed under difficult but necessary to include.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one event that actually did get a lot of coverage and attention was the bushfires in Australia back in about 2020. These fires were just, I mean, it was awful. They were devastating, they were shocking. And I remember seeing coverage of a little koala bear that was kind of all burned, and someone trying to pour water on him from a water bottle, and just, awful stuff. And it was estimated that 3 billion animals were harmed or killed in that event. And you also say in your book that there's someone who said that they could be more like in the trillions if you include insects and invertebrate animals and sea life, as we were talking about. And you said, quote, such numbers are difficult to comprehend, but they translate into individual animal suffering on a colossal scale. So, what is the significance of events like this?
The scale, I think, is incredible, and that at least was an event that did receive a fair bit of mainstream media coverage. And yeah,
Right.
we
Yeah.
also all saw those disturbing pictures of koalas with their skin peeling off or being killed. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's the visibility within the media which was really significant. So yeah, events like this underline the shared vulnerability between humans and other animals and the broader ecologies in which we live. So these sorts of events can be really significant, but the danger is how quickly they become forgotten about, and the
Yeah.
failure of those in sort of leadership positions to ensure that such events act as catalysts for transformative change. We're just sort of it's like we're just watching a movie and passively not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
they it's difficult to know how to elevate their significance to to make them those catalysts for transformative change. It's like what else needs to happen for people to act? It's a difficult one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think about the Maui fire as well. And, Maui, the Hawaiian Islands are
Yeah.
are such a rich biological uh diverse place, and there's so many species there that are nowhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard one thing about how it affected the wildlife or wild animals in that area. You
Mm.
only hear about the human and the infrastructure. And yeah, I think it's a problem that when these huge events happen, not only, like you said, should they be catalysts for change, but we also need to look into how it affects the animals.
Yeah. So one of the reasons this is happening is that we failed to break out of our anthropocentric prison, but then we're just sort of, we're responding to these events from within the same vantage point. We're just reproducing the same mistake that caused them in the first place.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good point. So you also talk about farmed animals and how they also suffer from the effects of climate-related events like flooding and fires and heat waves. So let's talk about farmed animals and how they're affected by all this.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't just want to focus on so-called wild animals in that chapter. So I do have some focus on companion animals, and I do have some focus on farmed animals. And so, yeah, it doesn't take too much to understand how farmed animals are also being impacted by these extreme weather events and the background changes as well. So, farmed animals are drowning in flooding events, and they're dying from heat exhaustion or from fires or suffocating in smoke, or the disease prevalence is also increasing due to temperature rises as well, because disease vectors such as different ticks and so on can expand their range and affect more farmed animals. So there's lots of threats to farmed animals, and it's interesting that for quite a long time now, animal production scientists, or what are sometimes called meat scientists, they've been doing research around heat-resistant breeds of farmed animals, heat-resistant genotypes, to try to adapt farmed animals to a changing, warmer climate.
Mm,
But of course, I find that quite a warped logic. So it's
yeah.
anything to try to sort of sustain the system rather than to question the causes of climate change.
So in chapter 4, you get into animal agriculture's impact on climate change. And this is where we get into the weeds of admissions data. And I actually really don't like to talk about this. I don't ever mention a percentage of animal agriculture's impact on climate change because there's many to choose from. And I actually encourage other advocates not to do that either, like not to pick a percentage or cite a percentage. And I always say, don't do that unless you can write a whole chapter to analyze, all the proposed percentages from 11 to 51%. And you did that. You actually did write a chapter on this issue. So you, Richard, are allowed to talk about this with me. So if you can explain why there is such a wide range of numbers depending on the source. There's everything from the UN to World Watch and other NGOs and government agencies that put these numbers out. And we've got a wide range here, so it's a little it's frustrating to me because it looks to me like really you can kind of pick and choose your numbers depending on what your views are, what your worldview is, and I don't like that. It makes it look like we don't know what the science is. So, what do you advise advocates to say about this?
Sure. Yeah, I share your frustration, but I think in writing this book, I had to dive into the issue.
Yeah,
It would have been an odd book on this topic to somehow sidestep this issue. So
sure.
chapter 4 is, yeah, it's a beast of a chapter, and
Yeah.
the second half of chapter 4 exactly is devoted to looking at this issue, and I go into it in quite granular detail. Yeah, so in sociology, we understand science as being embedded within culture and within politics as well. So as much as scientists might want to think of themselves as objective and value free, then that's a very difficult state to reach, and that is a part explanation for why we have such a wide diversity of figures. So most people are familiar with the 2006 report by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. That report was called Livestock's Long Shadow.
Yeah.
And that quite well-known figure that they gave back in 2006 was 18% contribution. And
Right.
the
18%. I just want to be clear.
Exactly, one
Yeah.
eight, 18%.
Yes. Yeah.
And since 2006, they've come up with three other numbers, although they haven't made such a big deal about publicizing them all, okay, to the same extent as the first one.
Hmm.
And there's a really, really interesting story that I unravel in that part of the chapter, in terms of how there was a lot of pushback to that 18% figure from animal agricultural industries and also some national governments, which were big economies in terms of animal agriculture. So there was a lot of political pressure put on the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization after that livestock's long shadow. And all their subsequent percentage numbers have been reductions on that 18% figure. So they had 14.5% is another well-known figure that has been quoted, and that was released in 2013. And then a bit more recently, they produced a figure of 15.6 that didn't receive too much publicity. And then just last year, they put their figure all the way down to 11.15%. And
Yeah.
again, that
Uh,
didn't receive that much publicity.
thank
Um,
goodness.
yeah. So what happened after Livestock's Long Shadow is that there was really a really concerted attempt by the animal ag industry to influence the FAO. Now, people need to know that the FAO has had a close relationship with animal agriculture for decades, and it's to the credit of the authors of Livestock's Long Shadow that they were actually able to write that report in some ways because they were really cracked down upon after that. So I had noticed something around this influence happening. And then I got talking with an investigative journalist by the name of Arthur Naslin. And he ended up doing this expose of the FAO, which was published in the Guardian newspaper, the UK newspaper. And that came out in October of last year. And investigative journalism is so important because they can do things which social researchers can't necessarily do. They can get into kind of interview situations which probably academics can't get into. And Arthur found that, and he interviewed people that had been involved in livestock long shadow. He found that the FAO had played down the role of animal agriculture in climate change. And he also found that the FAO had censored some of the work of its own scientists as well
Mm,
in
wow.
talking about the contribution of methane from animal agriculture. So the FAO has really sort of brought their own process into disrepute and really ruined their own credibility. Also, their work has never been properly subject to the high standards of scientific peer review, I would argue, as well.
Really?
And a lot of people were using 14.5% even up until recently. And even though 14.5% was released in 2013, the data it was based on was from 2005. So
Oh,
incredibly, people have been using that figure, say, last year, and without even realizing that it was 18 years out of date.
wow.
So, some of the kind of ineptitude of the FAO even kind of caused me to make an incorrect estimate as well, because I wrote this paper a few years ago saying, oh, it looks like maybe it should be 16.5, but then I hadn't taken into account that they had not kind of been forthcoming with some of their data. So that was
Mm,
also all sort of interesting to get involved with. But then I kind of, at least in the book, I kind of bring it all up to date. Oh, by the way, just before I go on, you mentioned the World Watch report with the
yeah,
51%
the
figure.
51%. Yeah.
I never gave that particular credibility. So they came up with such a high figure because they were arguing that the respiration
Respiration,
of
yeah.
farmed animals was increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and I've never seen a peer-reviewed paper which actually said that was true.
Hmm.
So I was always thinking, well, ooh, it's like a bit of confirmation bias where animal activists want to jump on the highest figure,
Yeah.
and we need to stick to the evidence base. So what I do is kind of I go to non-FAO work and I quote a figure from a 2021 study by Zhu, that's XU et al., which was published in one of the Nature journals. They come up with a figure for the whole food system of 34%, and they extrapolate from that animal agricultural production being around 20% or 19.95. So at
Hmm.
least at least that's a figure which is quite similar to the livestock's long shadow figure
The
of all
18.
of nearly 20 years ago.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's a reasonable one to cite. But yeah, it's kind of an unsatisfactory situation. but I at least kind of I'm able in that chapter to outline the kind of political context of these knowledge claims.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that is what I recommend. I also go into some other reasons why the FAO data is potentially unreliable. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's an important story to tell, and I'm sure we'll see more twists and turns in the future. But
Yes.
yeah, I think, I sympathize with you in saying to people not to even quote a figure because it's become so politicized. But I'm not confident in the most recent FAO figure. Probably like rule out the really high figures, rule out the low figures, and it's probably something around between a fifth and sixth of emissions as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It gives someone a way to push back. Like, well,
Mm.
there's numbers all over the place, so we really don't know. So it's probably, low or whatever.
Yeah.
It's frustrating in that way. And I'm
Mm.
curious if you know, and you might not know, but do the other sectors have this kind of wide range as well? Like transportation or the energy sector, or do the other sectors have this kind of wide-ranging numbers, or are they pretty set? I'm just curious. I don't know if you know.
Well, it's interesting because other sectors don't tend to even get bogged down in a figure. So I've never actually seen a figure for the energy sector.
Really?
Obviously that would be the highest percentage.
Yeah.
I'm not writing this book to deny that fossil fuels are the a major
Number
reason
one,
for
yeah.
climate change. But what I am writing this book is to kind of encourage people not to reduce the climate crisis down to fossil fuels and to ignore the food system.
Right.
Transport, I have seen a figure in the past for transport, but it was quite old, and I think it was around about 12%.
Huh.
But it is as you imply, it's quite noticeable that other sectors haven't sort of got bogged down in the politics of a percentage figure.
Right.
But it has taken the IPCC, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's taken them a long time to even include the food system and agriculture into its activities.
Yeah. Yeah. And people don't realize that fossil fuel, there is such an impact in the animal agriculture sector with transportation and pesticides and, the refrigeration and
Yeah.
the slaughter process and everything. So
Yeah.
fossil fuels are certainly a huge part of that animal agriculture number. It's not just methane.
Absolutely. Every sector is overlapping, isn't it? So
Yeah.
yeah, we can't sort of neatly divide them out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Big stuff. Okay. Well, I think, and what I often say is that it is a significant impact. Like animal agriculture has a significant impact on climate change. And, that we don't have to put a number on it. That's
Mhm.
true enough.
And I think that language is fair and it's also scientifically robust as well. Yeah.
Good. All right. Okay. Well, interestingly, you say something about when you're getting into solutions, you talk about how transitioning to new methods of farming, and here I'm assuming you're talking about things like regenerative grazing and that kind of thing, that these are not the answers, and that reduction and eventual elimination of animal foods should be and is the answer. And this really tracks with my nonprofit Compassionate Living's Humane Hoax Project. And the more that I dig into these supposed alternatives in the environmental labeling, the more that we see it's all just greenwashing, and that actually some of these new methods, like grass-fed beef, can actually be worse and cause more emissions than conventional production. There's numerous studies coming out now that are showing that. So reduction to elimination should really be our only message, I feel, and the only thing we should be putting our funding and energy into. Do you have anything you want to add to this or say about this?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the reason it isn't the only message is purely for cultural and political and sociological reasons.
Yeah.
So yeah, listeners will be pleased to know that although the book is clearly covering quite heavy and difficult subject matter, I do towards the end of part one start to think more positively and to think about getting into solutions. And the entire second half of the book, part two of the book, is called Transforming Meat Cultures and has another 4 chapters. And so, yeah, the urgency of the climate crisis means we need to go after the solutions that offer the greatest benefits in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So, tinkering with the efficiency of animal agriculture, it seems to me to be a rather transparent way to try to protect the status quo. We need transformative and just transitions that attend to the systems and practices that are causing this crisis. And the protection of the status quo is all about the protection of power and profit. That doesn't mean that, I want people's livelihoods to be destroyed. In thinking about just transition, I feel that we need to pay attention to that. In my reformulated account of climate and food justice, I'm trying to undermine the system that manages to oppress humans and other animals alike, and expose how this ideology of anthropocentrism isn't even in our own interests, even though it seems to be from its name, but it's
Mm,
actually it's undermining the possibilities of life for ourselves as well.
mm,
And so I make the argument that a critical animal studies approach to the climate crisis not only must contest the idea that animals are commodities, but also that food itself is a commodity. And so this is my sort of extra message to the animal activist and environmental activist community towards the end of the book that a profit-led food system is bad for animals, it's bad for the environment, it's also bad for human health. We should state that the aim of animal advocacy should be to take the food system out of the market. And I realize that's a big utopian idea, but when we're dealing with theories of transformative change, we're inevitably going to go into areas which get labeled utopian. But we need to
mm.
think about how the movement for justice for non-human animals very much overlaps with these other causes. And it's, when you've got a profit-led food system, it's not going to deliver food justice to humans. And we also need to obviously understand how it's unjust for non-human animals as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that idea of food for everyone, everyone well fed in the world, and fed with healthy plant foods. Yeah, it's
It,
utopian,
it,
but it
it
should
could
be
be done.
basic.
It could be done. We need our positive imaginaries of the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. You have to be able to envision it or it won't come to be.
Yep.
Yeah. I love that. And I also like you mentioned about just transitions for farmers and I like to say that we're not against farmers. We so often hear, the vegans against the farmers and this, there's this antagonistic that vegans hate farmers. And it's no, no, it's not that we, hate farmers. It's the system that's exploiting animals. That's what we don't like. We just want to see them farming and growing plant foods. That's all. So justly transitioning them to growing plant foods and still being economically viable while we're still within the market model, is very important, I think, and a great thing to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of debates going on in the UK at the moment about the shifting role of the farmer and how they're resisting top-down change, which would reinvent their role somewhat towards being conservationists and taking on an environmental role, which I think, is really important. But it's how, I guess it's how the policy is enacted. And then some animal rights groups in the UK are trying to make important bridges with farmers as well. And so there's even a group being formed called Vegans Support the Farmers. So
Hmm.
it's trying to make those, I guess, compassionate links, which, I understand are challenging for some people to make. If veganism as a philosophy, it obviously embodies values of compassion and understanding, then it's difficult to conclude that wouldn't be part of a vegan vision for the
Yeah,
future.
absolutely. Well, you say something that I often say, which is that if we can focus on the food sector when we're talking about climate change and transition the world to a plant-based diet, then there's no need for technological advancements or big infrastructure change, which can mean, lots of you need a lot of money, big money, government involvement, all of that, when we're talking about changing our energy sector and those kinds of big infrastructure changes. When you're talking about global transition to plant-based diet, all you need is the will for people to make those changes in the market, at the restaurant. It's really a grassroots level change where we could see, reduction of emissions, dramatic reduction of emissions. But of course, the challenge there is, and you mentioned it a little while ago, the challenge there is cultural and sociological and psychological. But if we can get over that hurdle, it could really be a quick way to turn this around. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure, yes, it's cultural, sociological, psychological, and political. Those are the main barriers. In that second part of the book, I have a chapter trying to really understand why these practices of animal source food consumption have become so embedded in a relatively short period of time. So, the increases in consumption levels, took place after the Second World War. People seem to have forgotten or never had that historical awareness of the levels of animal source food consumption now are abnormal. They've become normalized in a really short period of time. And I think it's just useful for everyone to have that awareness because they maybe perhaps need to sit back and think how and why that change has happened and who has benefited from that change.
Yeah.
So yeah, in the second part of the book, I've got a chapter 5, which it's called A Child's Right to Contest Meat Culture. So that's really looking at, how we learn these messages and meanings in our childhood, but also looking at the possibility for children to resist the imposition of these social norms. Yeah, I get into the detail of that. Our ideas of childhood, for example, discourses of childhood innocence, they act as a kind of convenient excuse for protecting children from the realities of what our societies do to animals. So we hide the slaughterhouse, and we also don't, or we feel uncomfortable about talking to children about human-animal relations, and we also feel uncomfortable about talking to them about the climate crisis as well, like Greta Thunberg and how she's politicized childhood, and also looking at the education system in quite a big way and how that could be changed. And then I go on a couple of chapters theorizing different ideas of transition and coming up with some suggested interventions based on a particular sociological theory of transition that I work with. And then I've got this sort of final chapter, which is engaging with those big debates about plant-based capitalism and recognizing that ironically, supermarkets, big corporations, supermarkets have probably done more to normalize plant-based eating than any political leader. So that's ironic. And so, but I'm suggesting that we should have a critical distance towards plant-based capitalism, even though it's serving its purpose in terms of normalizing some aspects, but probably also depoliticizing veganism at the same time. And then I'm kind of moving on to kind of consider what system change would look like, a sort of much more transformational change than plant-based capitalism. But, we're a long way from where we need to be. So I can have some sympathy with people that are going down the pro plant-based capitalism route as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You touched on so much there. And yeah, culturally focusing on young people, you have a whole chapter on that, on children and how they are taught meat eating is habitual and normative, and that it's just the way it is, and how that needs to shift. And that was really, really fascinating. I loved how you called Greta Thunberg, that she's been called the killjoy of childhood innocence or something like that. It's really fascinating stuff there. I don't know if you want to talk a little more about that.
Sure. That's actually that was my term.
That's great.
I I've done some work in the past working with the idea of the killjoy, which is actually taken from a really interesting feminist theorist called Sarah Ahmed. And I've taken her ideas of the feminist killjoy and applied them to the idea of the vegan killjoy. And then we've got somebody like Greta Thunberg who's interesting because she is both a feminist, a climate activist. She's also a vegan. That she's doing all sorts of interesting political things, and she's also, as I point out in the book, she's triggering a lot of archetypal right-wing men. And so, she's had her run-ins with Donald Trump, and she's had her run-ins with the former Prime Minister of Australia, who are both very,
Mm,
people have said very nasty things about Greta Thunberg, and they've been very sort of ableist as well. Yeah, I was really happy to include that chapter on childhood, and I think it adds something to the book overall.
yeah. Yeah, and you also mentioned something about you get into this in I think the last chapter about plant-based culture and this kind of wave of what I would call kind of soft veganism, where people feel more comfortable saying plant-based and it's more about the food and all of that kind of overshadowing maybe ethical or activist veganism. Do you want to talk a little more about that? Because I think that's really fascinating too, and something that's definitely happening and like you were saying, happening in our supermarkets.
So yeah, it's a really difficult question in terms of strategies around veganism. I'm quite sympathetic with the idea of sticking with veganism and making it more intelligible and understandable because I think people just misunderstand what it means.
Yeah.
So yeah, I certainly don't go down the pathway of like some people have said that we should even no longer use the term. So I don't subscribe to that view. But yeah, I realize it's complicated, and I do cover that some of that debate in that final chapter for sure.
Yeah, I think it's very important for us to continue using the word. It's the only way truly to describe the food. It's the only thing that truly means no meat, dairy, or eggs. Even if you don't want to call yourself a vegan, at least say, I eat vegan food, because that's really the only way to describe what it is. Plant based does not necessarily mean vegan. So there's that. But at the same time, like you said, people maybe just misunderstand. They hear vegan and they think a certain amount of things instead of what perhaps they should think of is not causing suffering to animals and, living a compassionate life, things like that, that aren't necessarily as associated with the word. So, yeah, I think it's just important for us to get our message out in a better, more comprehensive way.
I agree, and I think it's a communication issue. There's a lot of meanings of veganism that are actually, I think, appealing to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think we just need to work more on that.
Yeah.
Um, at my book launch a couple of weeks ago, I made the joke. So in my supermarket, obviously they have the vegan food section, and it's all the plant-based meats and so on and that kind of thing. So I want to put a little sign up in the fruit and vegetable section saying "Welcome to the vegan section," because we need to normalize that.
Yeah, you guess what? You eat vegan sometimes.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
great.
So everybody, apart from these poor unfortunate people on social media that claim they're eating 100% carnivorous diet, apart from that very strange minority that, everybody is eating vegan food in
Yeah,
every day of their lives, and labeling that section, the other section as the vegan food section is a bit of a strange one, and it's
yeah,
also prioritizing a particular way of vegan eating over something which is more like a whole food vegan diet, which I tend to kind of come out in favor of in the book because, I want to make links between health. I don't want to sort of have this rivalry between a vegan for the animals and a health vegan, because I think once we take an intersectional vegan view, then we need to understand how health is really important for social justice. And
mm,
so, it's really important to make those links between veganism and social inequalities in health along lines of social class and race and gender and so on. So yeah, I'm trying to heal those divides within veganism as well.
mm. That's good. That's good for me to hear because I have gotten so deep into the ethics that I have kind of not rejected, but don't pay attention to the health side and arguments. I feel like it's kind of a whole separate advocacy. But you're right, there's a lot of bridges that need to be kept there.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Richard, this has really been a wonderful and fascinating and important discussion. I'm so glad we had you on. We like to end, though, on a happy note. What gives you hope for the future?
Sure. So in some respects, in a book like this, I have to sort of tell it how it is, and there's a responsibility to be honest and to be faithful to the evidence. And so, there is that sort of difficult side that we have to engage with. So the conclusion is titled as follows: Unearthing Hope from Real Pessimism in the Alliances Yet to Be.
Mm,
So I'm being a little bit playful there. And what I'm saying is we have to be careful not to sugarcoat the subject with false optimism. And so not do that kind of a lot of climate change books end with the message of hope. And I can see that's totally important. But we need to tell it how it is, and we need to try to use that positively as a catalyst for change. But of course, in the book there are messages of hope as well. Obviously, the first message is that, the climate crisis is a highly significant issue for the ethics of human-animal relations. And, some people might criticize animal advocates and vegans for sort of jumping on the climate issue because they think, oh, that's the kind of way that we can get the vegan message into the public sphere. But it is genuinely and inescapably an issue of the ethics of human-animal relations. And that's a message, another message of the book. I find hope in about maybe four different areas. So the ability of people to construct and practice alternative social imaginaries, and that's just a term to mean the collective images of how we might live. I talk in that final chapter 8 about what are called prefigurative practices, which is just a fancy way for saying how people are living in the here and now, how they want to see the future. So we're enacting the future in the here and now. So I see so much hope from people who get it and aren't afraid to listen to the science and aren't afraid to confront what is going on. So there's a lot of hope for me there. And also, secondly, in the critical thinking skill set offered by my own discipline of sociology, and maybe many sociologists haven't been so great on this issue, but at least we have that kind of background heritage in our discipline of contesting social norms and also trying to understand social change. And that sort of gives me hope as well. There's a lesson to be learned in the wider population for engaging with sociology and philosophy and the way in which it kind of liberates our thinking. And thirdly, then I guess relatedly, I find hope in our communities of practice. So whether that's vegans or environmentalists or feminists or queer activists and the young and the old who are acting, putting their bodies on the line in climate activism. I think unavoidably that is hopeful, even as they receive a lot of denigration in the media. And yeah, as the title of the conclusion implies, fourthly and finally, there's hope for me in the alliances that are yet to be. So I think, there's always been a message within critical animal studies and also within areas like ecofeminism, which is also an important influence on me, that we need to make sort of coalitional alliances. And we do probably need to and I say we, the kind of animal advocacy community, needs to target the left more. So the left, the political left, need to take human-animal relations more seriously, and
yes.
and actually that could be, the avenue for transformative change that can happen when otherwise progressive communities begin to embrace an oppositional vegan culture. So, most contemporary global north and some other cultures have begun, they've certainly made some inroads in normalizing vegan culture, but it still sits at a very low percentage level of overall people in a population. If the left would embrace veganism more, then we'd get levels up to 10, 15, 20%, and that would actually begin to constitute transformational change. So there is a little bit of a message at the end of the conclusion, a little bit of a taunt maybe towards towards the rest of the, kind of those who identify themselves as politically progressive, and how they can't perpetuate that kind of anthropocentric thinking in the face of the climate crisis and in the face of the overlapping biodiversity crisis.
Yeah, well, good. That's a lot of hopeful thoughts. I love it. I actually pulled a quote that I wanted to end with here that I feel is a hopeful quote from the book. And you say, quote, veganism is not a panacea for the climate crisis, but is part of an alternative, transformatory imaginary, which is concerned not only with rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also with engendering new, just societies that are truly respectful of other species. And I love that. I love that you are including that human animal relation within, climate justice and within this larger piece of the climate crisis. It's really, really wonderful. Great book, Richard. Wonderful job.
Thank you, Hope. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I love that Richard had numerous things that he found hopeful. That question at the end, it can be tough for some guests to answer, but here's someone who knows just how dire the situation is deeply and intimately, and still he has hope, and I do too. I'd like to remind everyone about our upcoming Humane Hoax Chicken webinar. It's going to be on May 4th, 2024. I hope you can join us. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. This year, we have really interesting topics. We've got everything from chicken folklore to the avian flu epidemic and crisis to chicken advocacy strategies. I'm going to be covering that, and I'm also going to talk about that in our next upcoming podcast. So watch for that. But please join us if you can, May 4th. We're also going to have a tribute to Karen Davis of United Poultry Concerns, who died last year. So you can find the registration link in the show notes. It's free to register, and I hope to see you there. I really hope that you will use this Earth Day to take some action for the planet, to help the Earth and her animals. One thing you can do is share this episode. You could perhaps share it in an online environmental group or forum, maybe share it with a local or national environmental organization, or just share it with someone you know who's concerned with the environment. Also, giving a 5-star rating and review on a podcast app, whichever one you listen to, like Apple Podcast or others, that is super helpful as well. Make every day Earth Day and live vegan.